The harsh, cold winds of the mountain wilderness could freeze a man's spirit, but for one prospector, a simple idea buried beneath the frozen earth would turn the tides of survival. What began as a humble experiment in heat quickly became the secret to life in the unforgiving winter, challenging everything the other prospectors thought they knew. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode brings even more groundbreaking survival tactics. The wind howled as if it had a vendetta against anyone foolish enough to set foot in the wilderness during winter. Cold, biting, and relentless, it whipped through the barren trees, carrying the promise of an unforgiving season. Yet, in the midst of it all, one cabin stood out. It was an unremarkable structure at first glance, a few logs stacked together with a thick layer of snow atop the roof. But if you looked closely, you'd see something that none of the other prospectors had. A small, discreet vent near the base of the wall, hidden under a pile of snow. Inside, the warmth was palpable, a stark contrast to the freezing storm outside. A man knelt by a stove, adjusting the flame with a careful, methodical hand. His long, dark beard and wild hair framed a face that looked like it had been carved by the mountain winds themselves, tough, weathered, and a little untamed. His name was Elias Callahan, a prospector who had come to these parts years ago, seeking fortune but finding only struggle. The others in the camp, more experienced and far more cynical, had laughed at his plan to build a stove pit buried beneath the ground. They'd mocked him when he first mentioned it, a furnace of sorts, set deep in the earth to heat his cabin throughout the brutal winter. "You're wasting your time," they told him. "You'll freeze to death trying to make it work." But Elias didn't care. He had seen the dangers of the mountain winters firsthand, felt the bitter cold gnawing at his bones, and he knew that survival was a game of innovation, not tradition. While the others huddled around their fires and whispered doubts, Elias had set to work, digging a pit beneath his cabin and lining it with stone, creating an underground furnace that would remain hidden from the world. Days turned into weeks as Elias labored, the mocking laughter of the others still ringing in his ears. They thought him foolish, as they always had. But when the first heavy snowfall arrived, and the others' fires sputtered out under the weight of the relentless wind, Elias's cabin remained warm. Not just warm, comfortably warm. He smiled as he stoked the fire inside the pit, the heat radiating up into the floorboards and filling the cabin with the kind of warmth the others had forgotten was even possible. As the wind raged outside, Elias's cabin became a beacon of survival, and the prospectors who once mocked him began to take notice. Yet, Elias didn't feel the satisfaction of their grudging respect. He simply turned his attention back to the stove, hands steady as he adjusted the flame. For him, it was never about proving the others wrong. It was about ensuring that he would survive. It wasn't long before the first real test came. The mountain winters were harsh, unyielding in their severity. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Elias noticed something strange. The wind didn't just howl, it raged, and with it came something far more dangerous. A storm. A storm like none the mountains had seen in years. The other prospectors had already abandoned their cabins, seeking shelter in the nearest town or huddling around a few makeshift fires. But Elias didn't have that luxury. His cabin was built with a purpose designed not only to withstand the weather, but to thrive within it. When the snow began to fall in thick, suffocating sheets, Elias closed the shutters on his windows, secured the door with thick wooden bars, and stoked the fire beneath the floor. Outside, the world disappeared beneath a blanket of snow. The wind screamed like a living thing, clawing at the wood, threatening to tear it from its foundation. But inside, the cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Elias sat near the stove, watching the flames dance as they consumed the wood. There was no bitterness in the air, no frost creeping along the edges of the walls. The cabin held, just as he'd planned. The stove pit, buried beneath the earth, kept the heat constant, slowly radiating upwards into the very bones of the cabin. But the storm was relentless, and as the hours passed, Elias could feel the strain of the weather pressing against the walls. The stove was holding strong, but for the first time, Elias wondered if it would be enough. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the roof. Elias froze. The storm had grown so fierce that the snow was beginning to accumulate in dangerous quantities. The weight of it could easily collapse a roof. He rushed to the window, pulling the heavy shutter open, and saw nothing but a blinding white expanse. His heart raced. The roof had already begun to sag under the pressure. For a moment, panic crept in, but then he remembered why he had built the stove pit to begin with. His cabin wasn't just a refuge from the cold, it was a symbol of his resolve. He couldn't afford to let it fail. Stepping quickly to the door, Elias grabbed the axe he had left by the hearth and began to shovel snow from the roof. The wind howled louder, but Elias didn't falter. With each swing, the snow lightened and the burden on the roof lessened. The stove continued to hum, the warmth still enveloping him in its protective embrace. His cabin was more than a structure, it was a lifeline, and it was holding strong. For now, Elias knew he was safe. But the storm had only just begun. Days passed, and the storm continued to rage outside, blanketing the mountains in a deep, unrelenting silence. But within the walls of his cabin, Elias found peace. The heat from the buried stove pit was more than enough to keep the cabin warm, and for the first time since he'd arrived in these mountains, he felt a sense of control. The others had long since abandoned their posts, running for safety in the face of the fierce storm. But Elias remained. He knew that survival wasn't just about living through a single storm, it was about mastering the mountain, learning its rhythms, and building something that would allow him to endure its wrath. The idea that had once seemed so absurd to the other prospectors had now become a lifeline for Elias. His buried stove pit was more than just a practical solution, it was his answer to the mountain's unforgiving winters, a creation born out of necessity but refined with a relentless determination. As the days wore on, Elias began to take meticulous care of the stove, ensuring it ran smoothly. He was up before dawn, feeding the fire, checking the vents, adjusting the temperature. Every morning, he could hear the snow falling softly against the roof, the wind carrying the sound of branches snapping under the weight of the storm. But inside, it was warm, peaceful even. The cabin, once a crude shelter thrown together in a hurry, was now a symbol of Elias's survival. He'd made minor repairs to the walls, reinforcing the gaps with materials he'd scavenged during previous trips. Yet, despite his improvements, he couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. The wind was still howling outside, and Elias knew that at any moment the storm could escalate further, bringing new dangers he hadn't yet prepared for. This thought consumed him. He couldn't rest until his cabin, his fortress, was as impenetrable as possible. So, he began again. Elias spent hours every day rethinking every corner of the cabin, inspecting every inch of wood and every crack in the walls. What had started as a simple stove pit evolved into an obsession. He added small changes, better insulation, reinforced door frames, and even an innovative locking mechanism for the cabin's door, something designed not only to keep out wildlife but also to prevent human intrusion. Every night, he would sit in the glow of the stove, turning over possibilities in his mind. Could he make the cabin more secure? Could he add more heat, perhaps even a method to store warmth overnight? It didn't matter that the others had mocked him when he first proposed the stove pit idea. Elias had discovered something that they hadn't. The secret to survival in the harshest of winters was not just about brute strength or firepower. It was about creating something that could withstand the worst the wilderness could throw at it, without needing to fight back. Elias wasn't sure how long the storm would last, but his resolve had already been set. The work he had done on the stove had worked, but he knew that there were other ways to improve. Elias had only just begun, and this storm would be his proving ground. When the storm finally passed, leaving the mountains in an eerie silence, Elias emerged from his cabin, breathing in the crisp air. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting a dim light over the snow-covered landscape. The wilderness had been transformed. What was once a raging, uncontrollable force was now a quiet, still expanse, holding its breath in anticipation. Elias made his way to the edge of the ridge behind his cabin, where he could survey the surrounding area. The ground was covered in a thick layer of snow, the trees bowed under the weight, and the mountain seemed to have swallowed up everything in its path. But despite the destruction all around him, Elias felt something else, a sense of calm. He had survived the storm, and his cabin had remained intact. The buried stove pit had performed as he had hoped, keeping his home warm through the worst of the storm. But now, he realized, the true test had yet to come. He had succeeded in creating a solution to the immediate problem of warmth, but the mountain was far from predictable. There would be more storms, harsher conditions, and more unforeseen threats. The real question was, could his stove and his cabin endure the long haul? Elias stood there, his face wind-blown and weathered, as he studied the landscape. The tracks of wildlife were scattered across the snow, evidence of the life that continued even in the harshest of conditions. He thought about the other prospectors, those who had mocked him, and wondered if they had found refuge from the storm. He doubted it. His cabin was more than just a shelter now. It was a statement. A testament to what one man could accomplish if he was determined enough. Elias had seen the weaknesses of the mountain men's traditional shelters, their flimsy walls, poorly insulated roofs, and weak doors that offered little resistance to the elements or wildlife. But he had found a way to make something better. The stove pit was only the beginning. His cabin, his fortress, would stand tall against the harsh winters, no matter what came next. As he made his way back inside, he felt a familiar weight on his shoulders. It wasn't fear, but responsibility. The stove pit had proven itself, but Elias knew that one successful winter didn't guarantee the same outcome in the future. He had to keep pushing, keep improving, because survival on the frontier wasn't a guarantee, it was a constant battle. He knelt beside the stove again, adding another log, the fire crackling and popping as it consumed the dry wood. This time, though, there was no more doubt in his mind. The mountain had tested him, and he had passed. The real challenge now was to see if the others could say the same. Weeks passed, and Elias settled into a rhythm. The storm had subsided, and the biting winds of winter still roamed the mountains. But his cabin remained a warm sanctuary against the cold. Every day he tended to the stove pit, tweaking it here and there, ensuring that it continued to work flawlessly. His days were spent maintaining his cabin, scouting nearby trapping grounds, and gathering more firewood. His obsession had given way to a routine predictable and steady, yet deeply satisfying. Then one afternoon, as Elias ventured out to check the nearby beaver traps, he returned to find his cabin surrounded by footprints in the fresh snow. They were unmistakably human, and the sight of them sent a ripple of unease through his chest. He wasn't expecting company. Few ever ventured this far into the wilderness, and even fewer knew of his isolated existence. Elias paused, hand hovering over the rifle slung across his back as he scanned the area for signs of danger. The footprints led to the door of his cabin, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always been a man of solitude, keeping to himself in these harsh mountains. The prospectors, who had once mocked his stove pit, were nowhere near, their camps abandoned long ago as the winter had claimed them one by one. But these tracks were fresh, and their approach was deliberate. His first instinct was to retreat, to take the long way around and avoid any confrontation. But curiosity and the fierce protection of his home drove him forward. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the door, every step measured. There, standing just outside the cabin, were two men. They were dressed in the typical gear of mountain men, thick woolen coats, worn leather gloves, and boots caked with snow. One of them, a younger man with a patchy beard, stepped forward. "You, Elias Callahan?" the younger man asked, his voice rough from the cold. Elias said nothing at first, sizing up the men. They didn't appear hostile, but in these parts, that was never something you took for granted. After a tense pause, he nodded slowly, his hand resting on the rifle. "We heard about the cabin," the older man spoke, his face weathered and hardened from years in the mountains. "Word gets around and people are talking. They say you've built something different." Elias's heart skipped a beat. The stove pit, the changes he had made to his cabin, had his reputation spread that far? "I've built a home," Elias replied evenly, his voice steady. "And it works." The younger man glanced over at the cabin, eyes widening at the sight of the smoke rising from the chimney. "Don't think we've seen anything like it," he muttered. The older man, though, wasn't so easily impressed. "You've got something special here, but you know, not everyone survives out here, not with the winters, not with the bears." Elias could feel the challenge in the air, the unspoken question. Was his cabin truly as secure as he thought? Were his innovations enough to withstand the full force of the wilderness, or was it just a temporary solution? He held their gaze, not backing down. It works. And it'll keep working, as long as I make sure it does. The older man gave a slow nod, then took a step back. You'll need to show us how it's done. Survival's a hard game out here. Without saying another word, the two men turned and began to walk toward the edge of the clearing, their tracks leading deeper into the snow. Elias watched them go, a feeling of unease settling over him. The wilderness had been his to conquer, but now, for the first time, he wondered if his creation was truly as unbreakable as he believed. The next day, the two men returned. This time, they were carrying supplies, firewood, traps, and tools, and they wasted no time in setting to work near Elias's cabin. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were making themselves a part of the landscape, setting up camp not far from Elias's home. Elias didn't protest. There was no point. The men were here, and they'd come to stay. The days grew shorter as the mountain nights continued to grow colder, but Elias was resolved to make the best of it. He had never been one to shy away from adversity, and now, with two strangers on his doorstep, he was forced to confront new challenges. The men's presence meant more than just company, it meant potential danger. In a place like this, trust was a currency more precious than gold. The older man, whose name was Hunter, had proved to be a silent type, more focused on his work than conversation. His companion, Darrell, was more talkative, a young man eager to learn and prove his worth in the mountains. They kept their distance from Elias, but not too far. There was an unspoken understanding that they were all in this together now, whether Elias liked it or not. As the days passed, Elias grew more accustomed to their presence, though his suspicion never fully dissipated. The men were different from the others he had known, survivalists, like him, but with their own methods. The stove pit was the one thing they couldn't figure out. They watched him tend to the fire with quiet fascination, muttering among themselves when they thought he wasn't listening. One afternoon, after the fire had been stoked and the warmth of the cabin spread through the air, Hunter approached Elias as he worked on repairing a section of wall near the door. "I've been thinking," Hunter said, his voice low. "You've got something here. You've made your shelter strong. But strength doesn't come from walls alone. It's how we survive when it's just us out here, against the land, against the things we can't control." Elias looked up, meeting Hunter's steady gaze. "What are you getting at?" Hunter's eyes flickered briefly toward Darrell, who was busy collecting firewood nearby. "A test. We stay out here long enough to see what happens. We face the storms, the bears, the cold. You can show us how to survive, but in the end, we'll all find out if this cabin can stand up to the wilderness. The real test is not in what we build, but in how we endure." The words were simple, but they held weight. Elias felt a flash of uncertainty. Had he truly prepared for everything? The wilderness was full of unknowns, and no amount of wood, stone, or ingenuity could guarantee survival. But one thing was clear: this was a test he couldn't back away from. "Let's see," Elias said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Let's see if it holds." And so, the test began. As the storm clouds gathered once more on the horizon, Elias knew that this time, the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. It wasn't just his survival anymore. It was about proving that his creation, his fortress, could withstand everything the mountains could throw at it. The wind picked up in the early hours of the morning, howling through the trees like a living creature. Elias woke to the sound of branches scraping against his cabin's roof, the whispering rattle of the storm's fury. It was a warning, a reminder that winter had only just begun, and the mountain was still very much in charge. Outside, the world was cloaked in snow, the landscape barren and untouched, save for the tracks of the animals that moved quietly through the night. The two men, Hunter and Darrell, had become accustomed to Elias's way of life. They didn't question his methods anymore, though they were still fascinated by the buried stove pit and the way it kept the cabin warm, even as the temperatures outside dropped well below freezing. Elias had taken them under his wing, teaching them how to maintain their shelter, how to trap effectively, and how to survive when the mountains seemed to turn on them. But survival was about more than just building a shelter, it was about testing that shelter under the harshest conditions. And so, Elias knew it was only a matter of time before the real challenge came. That challenge arrived on the second day of the storm, when a massive grizzly bear appeared on the outskirts of their camp. Hunter was the first to spot it, his sharp eyes catching the hulking shape of the bear lumbering through the snow. Elias was already out the door, rifle in hand, as the men followed. The bear was a monster, at least 9 feet tall when it stood on its hind legs. Its thick fur was matted with snow, and its massive paws left deep tracks in the fresh powder. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the beast approach. The other 2 men stood behind him, their breath visible in the cold air, but they were silent. The bear sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it searched for food. The last thing Elias wanted was for the animal to grow curious about their cabin. The stove pit and reinforced walls had kept them safe, but this bear was different. This one was determined. The bear's massive head swung toward the cabin. It took a few heavy steps toward them, each step resonating with the power of the creature behind it. Elias moved slowly, trying not to startle it. Hunter and Darrell were behind him, but he could feel their eyes on him. The moment felt suspended in time, a test of everything he had built and everything he believed in. Then, with a deafening roar, the bear lunged. Elias didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle, taking aim at the bear's chest. He fired once, the shot echoing through the snow, but it missed. The bear didn't stop. It charged forward, its claws slashing through the air. In the split second before the bear reached them, Elias pushed Hunter and Darrell back toward the cabin. He shouted for them to run, his voice hoarse against the wind. They scrambled, but the bear was too fast, too powerful. Elias fired again, this time hitting its shoulder. The bear roared in pain but kept coming, more furious than ever. With a final burst of strength, Elias lunged forward, trying to close the gap between himself and the bear. His rifle was out of ammunition, but he didn't need it now. He had a plan, he just hoped the cabin was strong enough to survive the test. The bear was a blur of fury as it crashed toward Elias. The wind howled around them, the storm growing fiercer with each passing second. There was no time to think, only time to act. Elias's instincts kicked in. He turned on his heel, pushing the men behind him toward the cabin. The bear's claws slashed at the air, missing them by mere inches. "Get inside," Elias shouted, his voice strained as the bear bore down on them. The roar of the animal's growls was deafening as it charged again, but Elias was already halfway to the cabin door, throwing his weight into it and slamming it shut behind them. Inside, the cabin was warm, its stove burning steadily in the corner, but the heat couldn't erase the chill of terror that ran down Elias's spine. The bear was close now, too close. He could hear it scraping at the door, its massive claws raking against the wood. The door, reinforced with iron and the thick timber of the walls, creaked under the pressure, but it held firm. Hunter and Darrell were already at the windows, peering through the small gaps in the shutters, their faces pale but determined. Elias grabbed a heavy log from the firewood pile, pushing it against the door. The bear continued to claw at it, but the cabin held strong. Elias wasn't sure how long it lasted, but the struggle between the bear and the door felt like hours. Every crash against the wood sent a jolt of fear through him, but the cabin never gave way. The stove pit kept the temperature steady, and the reinforced walls and corners provided the strength he needed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear backed off. Elias could hear it huffing, its heavy breath mingling with the wind outside. It circled the cabin for a few moments, but eventually it retreated into the wilderness, disappearing into the storm. Elias exhaled, his hands trembling as he sank to the floor. "We made it," Darrell whispered, his voice shaking as he looked around at the walls that had withstood the attack. Hunter was silent, but his expression spoke volumes. He had been skeptical at first, but now there was no question in his mind. Elias had built something that could withstand the forces of nature, something that could keep them safe when it mattered most. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the cabin remained a sanctuary. Elias, Hunter, and Darrell gathered around the stove, the fire crackling softly in the background. The bear had tested them, but the cabin had held, and for the first time, Elias felt the full weight of what he had created, a fortress that could withstand more than just the cold. It had proven itself, and that was all that mattered. The aftermath of the bear's attack left an eerie silence hanging over the cabin. The storm outside had calmed, but the tension inside was thick with unspoken words. The warmth from the stove pit radiated through the wooden walls, a small but constant reminder of the safety Elias had built. He sat near the fire, his hands resting on his knees, lost in thought. Hunter and Darrell sat across from him, both staring into the fire, the flickering light casting shadows on their worn faces. Elias had always known that survival in the wilderness was about more than just strength. It was about adaptability, preparation, and the ability to outsmart nature. The bear had tested him in his cabin, but it wasn't the brute force of the animal that had been the real threat. It was the unpredictability of nature, the suddenness with which everything could change. The storm had come without warning, and the bear's appearance had been just as unexpected. But the cabin had held, and that was the lesson Elias had been waiting for. Hunter broke the silence, his voice gruff from the cold. "I won't lie, I didn't think your cabin could hold up against that beast, but it did." Darrell nodded in agreement. "We saw how the logs held, how the door wouldn't give way. You've built something special here, Elias, something I never thought possible." Elias leaned back, his gaze never leaving the fire. "It wasn't just the door or the stove. It's the whole structure, the design. Every piece has a purpose. It's not about just building something to survive, it's about building something that endures." The words hung in the air, the weight of them settling on the three men. It wasn't just the bear they had survived, it was their ingenuity, their ability to anticipate the challenges of the wilderness. "I've spent my whole life in the mountains," Elias continued, his voice steady. "But it took me losing my partner to realize what really mattered. It wasn't just about surviving the seasons. It was about building something that could protect me, something that could stand against whatever came our way. The stove pit, it's just the beginning." Hunter shifted, his eyes reflecting a new understanding. "You didn't just build a cabin, you built a chance. A chance to survive," Darrell added quietly. The realization hit Elias hard. They hadn't just survived the bear, they had learned something deeper. They had learned how to face the wild and, in a way, tame it, how to endure, not by brute force, but by being smarter, more prepared. Elias knew now that this cabin, this refuge he'd built, wasn't just a shelter, it was a symbol. It symbolized their strength, their unity, and their ability to adapt. But most importantly, it was a testament to the fact that, in the end, survival wasn't just about living another day, it was about learning how to thrive. With the storm finally behind them, the world outside was covered in a blanket of pristine white snow. The mountain was quiet, almost serene, but there was a certain energy in the air, an unspoken sense of anticipation. Elias stood outside the cabin, his breath coming in short bursts as he watched the sun struggle to break through the Prospectors. Heavy clouds. The land had been cleansed by the storm, and for the first time in days, it felt like there was hope in the air. Hunter and Darrell were already moving around the clearing, gathering firewood and checking traps. Their movements were more efficient now, practiced after days of working together. Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched them. He had taught them not just how to survive, but how to adapt to the wilderness, how to think ahead, and most importantly, how to depend on each other. Survival wasn't a solitary pursuit. Elias had learned that early on. In the past, he had lived alone, relying solely on his own strength and wit. But now, with these two men by his side, he realized that survival wasn't just about individual effort, it was about community. It was about coming together when the storms came, when the bears roared, when the cold threatened to tear apart everything they had. Elias's cabin had become a home, not just for him, but for all of them. It had started as a place of refuge from the unforgiving wilderness, but now it was more than that. It was a foundation, a base from which they could build a future. As Elias took another look around at the snow-covered landscape, he knew that the hardest part was behind them. The wilderness had tried to break him, to drive him to despair, but instead it had made him stronger. He stepped forward, his boots crunching the snow beneath him, and joined Hunter and Darrell. They had a task ahead of them, to rebuild and to improve. The cabin needed more work. There were always ways to make it better, more secure. And beyond that, there were more challenges ahead. The wilderness wasn't done testing them. But Elias felt a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about surviving the next storm or bear attack. It was about building a life that could stand against whatever the mountains threw at it. The three of them worked in unison, their actions reflecting a new bond forged through struggle and triumph. As Elias swung the axe into another log, he realized that he was no longer alone. The wilderness, though vast and unforgiving, now felt less like an enemy and more like a partner, a challenge to rise to, a test of their resilience. The cabin stood firm behind them, a silent testament to their strength and ingenuity. It wasn't just a shelter, it was their future. Together, they would face whatever came next, and Elias knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger than survival. It was the beginning of a new life, a life built on the lessons they had learned, the bond they had forged, and the determination to thrive in the face of the wild.